Penny Wong is someone with whom needs no introduction. She's a former Minister of the Rudd and Gillard government. She's served as Minister for Climate Change, Energy Efficiency and Water. She's also served as Minister for Finance and Deregulation. Currently, she holds the shadow portfolio position for Investment and Trade, which she'll be giving her opening address about today. Please welcome Penny Wong.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for doing me the honour of inviting me to speak at the opening of this forum on progressive reform ideas for Labor's 2015 National Conference. Can I first also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I acknowledge my parliamentary colleague Andrew Lee, who's participating today, and of course the many other people from the Labor movement and beyond who are participating in this very important event. The Fabians have a long and proud history of promoting progressive thinking, both inside our Labor Party but also beyond it. And a feature of Fabianism is a focus on promoting change through ideas rather than slogans. A very welcome approach in today's politics. And I'd say to you that also, that too is Labor's way, and it's the reason Bill has described this year as a year of ideas. It's the reason we've challenged Australians to join us as we embrace constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, promote inclusive growth, confront domestic violence, make our superannuation system fairer and more sustainable, protect renewable energy and tackle climate change, reinvigorate the movement for an Australian Republic, achieve marriage equality and much more. And we've done that as a Labor Party while fighting the most regressive budget brought down since Stanley Melbourne Bruce lost his seat trying to do over Australian workers. Now, of course, Labor's National Conference will be a contest of ideas, and at times I'm sure it will be a robust one. There will be ideas about how we best achieve a fair, inclusive and prosperous Australia. Ideas about how that will shape the national debate all the way to the next federal election and help shape a shortened Labor government too. There will be debates about some of the issues you are discussing today, about asylum seekers, climate change, economic inequality, and it will be a debate that will be about preparing Labor for government. So today I want to enter the realm of ideas in this context and put to you the progressive case for trade. It can be summed up in a simple proposition. Trade benefits working people. It benefits working people by contributing to growth, improving productivity, by creating better paid, more rewarding and more secure jobs, and by delivering lower prices and greater choice for consumers. And I want to reinforce this proposition by first going back and reminding us all about the history of our party, like the Labor Party, and trade. Because Labor has deep roots in Australia's traded goods industries. The AW organised the shearers in the 1880s not to oppose international trade in Australia's then biggest export industry, but to press for fair wages and conditions. One of Australia's and Labor's greatest Prime Ministers, Ben Chifley, worked as an engine driver before entering Parliament, and the trains he steered between Bathurst and Sydney carried goods from Western New South Wales that were destined for export markets. And on the return journey, they brought back imported goods, everything from pianos and sewing machines to apparently Irish whiskey and corned beef. Just as hundreds and thousands of workers on our trains and trucks today move exports and imports around Australia. As Prime Minister in 1948, Chifley took Australia into the new multilateral system negotiated as part of the Bretton Woods post-war international economic architecture. And his vision for post-war economic reconstruction was to develop our manufacturing sector and new export markets, initially and in America, and presciently, over the long term, in Asia. The three most substantial decisions to reduce Australia's trade barriers, 1973, 1998 and 1991, were all made by Labor governments. Gough Whitlam cut tariffs by 25% and has said that the short-term aim of this cut was to reduce inflation and its longer-term aim was to improve the economy's efficiency. Certainly a more efficient economy was the primary motivation for the 88 and 91 tariff cuts by the Hawke and Keating government. But Hawke and Keating also recognised that tariffs were pushing up the prices of clothing, white goods, cars and other basic consumer items. And they recognised that there is nothing progressive about a policy which means working people struggled to afford decent school shoes for their children. It's been estimated that these cuts put around $4,000 a year into the pockets of the average Australian household and drove the modernisation of the Australian industry in the 80s and 90s. And one of the key reforms, I would say to you, which have contributed to Australia enjoying nearly a quarter of a century of uninterrupted economic growth. And of course our commitment to trade liberalisation was continued under the Rudd and Gillard governments. Exports and imports account for around 40% of Australia's GDP. Trade is inextricably tied up with Australian jobs. Jobs producing goods and services for export markets, goods and services which use imported inputs, and consider those industries which are strongly engaged in trade. They include agriculture, mining, oil and gas, manufacturing, transport, storage and distribution, tertiary education and wholesale and retail trade, industries which account for nearly 4 million Australian jobs. Miners, manufacturing workers, food processing workers, truck drivers, wharfies, warehousing workers, shop assistants, their jobs all depend on exports and imports. And the jobs of workers in hospitality are supported by our tourism exports, and the jobs of higher education workers are supported by the exports of education services. And of course, exporting doesn't mean only more jobs. In general, it has meant better jobs. Austrade research shows that on average exporters pay higher wages than companies operating only in the domestic market, and shows that exporters also provide more secure jobs, are more likely to provide employees with training, more likely to negotiate enterprise bargaining, and are more committed to workplace safety, and importantly for the future, are more than twice as likely to engage in innovation. Trade is especially important to us at the moment, as our economy faces headwinds. And if you look over the last 18 months, you will see domestic demand has been weak, which is one of the reasons we see unemployment rising under the Abbott government. And I say this to you, Australia can never rely solely upon our domestic economy to generate the growth we need to create jobs. Not today and not ever. Now, trade agreements, which are a topic of the moment, open up world markets for Australian businesses, allowing them to find new sources of demand for the goods and services our workers produce. And there are some in our movement who hanker for the days of protectionism, asserting that tariffs on imports support local jobs. I say protectionism is a false panacea. Tariffs push up prices for local consumers and producers, lead to uncompetitive industries and inefficient economy, but most importantly for a labour movement, they lead to jobs which are not sustainable. Sitting on the sidelines while other countries negotiate trade agreements is also a false panacea. Refusing to enter agreements that will allow our competitors to gain market share at Australia's expense is not the way forward. Let's take the recent Korea Free Trade Agreement, which I know was controversial. Korea is an important market for Australian beef exports, and our beef producers and all of the jobs which rely on those exports have been losing market share to the US in Korea. The reason for that, a US Korea Free Trade Agreement in 2011, which cut tariffs on American beef, putting our exporters at a competitive disadvantage. Under the Korean Free Trade Agreement, Korean and Australia Free Trade Agreement finalised last year, the same tariff cuts were extended to Australian beef. The fact is, without these cuts, Australian beef exports to Korea would have declined over the next few years as US beef gained an ever greater competitive advantage. With the cuts now in place, our beef exports are projected to increase by 57% in real terms by 2029. Now, I have made clear we believe the Abbott government should have secured a better agreement with Korea. But we also recognise the benefit that this agreement brought to Australia's and will bring to Australia's agricultural industries and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that that industry supports, including the food processing sector of manufacturing. Now, I have long been arguing that our national prosperity into the future demands deeper integration with the economies of our region. Labor people have always sought to build a better future for our children, and it is clear that the future lies in our region. 20 years ago, Paul Keating said, free trade in the Asia-Pacific can underwrite Australia's future. He said, it can give us sustainable growth, employment, a role in technological innovation, cultural stimulation and enrichment. It can substantially underwrite the democratic, rich and dynamic nation we want to be in the 21st century. Our economic welfare, our strategic opportunities, our national security and our cultural dynamism will all depend on how deeply we integrate with the fast-growing economies of Asia. We need to continue the Labor mission of trade liberalisation to ensure Australia can take advantage of the changes that will unfold in coming years. Changes like the growth in the Asian middle class, the emergence of global value chains and the rise of services. I briefly want to touch first on Asia's rising middle class. This now comprises around 500 million people. It is expected to increase more than sixfold in the next 15 years. That will be 3.2 billion middle-class consumers, or 2/3 of the world's middle class, in Asia by 2030. This will translate into rising demand for a range of goods and services, including those where Australia has a strong track record, like food, education, tourism, health and aged care, as well as financial and professional services. This must be our future. We also must look to the services sector. We know that there is a shift in economic activity towards services, which creates new opportunities as well as new challenges. In high-income OECD economies, services now account for 75% of GDP. By contrast, in East Asia's developing economies, services account for less than half of GDP. As these economies develop, their demand for services like education, tourism, healthcare, aged care, financial and professional services and others will expand. So gaining access for services in export markets presents challenges for trade policy. And this requires more than reducing barriers at the border, but requires deeper economic integration and tackling behind the border regulations which prevent services firms from entering new markets. Now, trade agreements should not undermine domestic regulations that deliver legitimate public policy goals, but they should increase international trade in services for the same economic reason Australia has always sought to increase trade in goods. I do want to come now to, I think, in many ways the most important issue in this discussion for Labor people, and that is how do we make trade best work for people? Because whilst globalisation brings great benefits, it can also unleash rapid, unpredictable and unsettling change. And we have to ensure that our citizens benefit from globalisation rather than being left behind. We have to be committed to giving people the tools they need to participate in the global economy. Tools like a quality education, mastery of workplace skills, an understanding of technology and the ability to adapt to change and learn new skills. In a globalised economy, these attributes are critical to our people's ability to succeed in the workplace and to cope with economic change. Our children will increasingly need to navigate changes in their occupations and their careers during their working lives. And this will require investment, reinvestment and renewal of human capital, just as our economy requires constant retooling and upgrading of physical capital. Unlike our opponents, Labor does understand deeply that trade policy must be complemented by investment in education, skills, infrastructure, innovation and research. It must address the rising inequality in our economy, and I'm very glad that that's the focus of one of the panels for discussion today. In fact, in a globalised economy, wouldn't it be daft to halve the ratio of school spending to GDP by 2055, to abandon trades training centres in schools, or to make it harder for people to go to university? Yet that is precisely what our current government has proposed. So in conclusion, I say this. Labor doesn't pursue trade liberalisation out of a blind adherence to abstract theories. We've always pursued trade liberalisation because it delivers concrete benefits for the people we represent. Because I am a progressive, I support free trade. But trade also places uneven pressures on our society. So because I support free trade, I also believe we must have proper social democratic institutions and progressive policies. That means insisting on high quality trade agreements that maximise local employment. It means trade agreements that do not undermine public policy in healthcare, the environment or labour rights. It means trade agreements supported by policies which have at their heart the expansion of opportunity. Investments in education, investments in innovation and infrastructure, investments in our people to ensure they have the best chance of prospering in a globalised economy. It does not mean pulling the shutters down. We in this nation have already experienced a closed economy model. As Paul Keating says, by the 1970s, that had turned Australia into an industrial museum. By contrast, the open economy model Labor embraced in the 80s has powered us through one of the longest periods of uninterrupted economic growth of any advanced economy in the world. Back in 1948, then Chifley could see that it was in the interest of Australian workers to foster new industries at home, to find new export markets abroad and to engage with Asia. As his successors, we have a responsibility to continue pursuing this vision in the 21st century. Good luck with your deliberations today. Thank you very much.